Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing amazing. We got a new channel called Ebla. That's not the channel. The channel is called Dig. Of course, videos in the description. But this video is called Ebla, the first world power. Immediately looking at this, I'm not sure if this is the Black Sea on the left-hand side or not. Can't really tell. Not that, or what this is. Ebla. This is the 1803 BC. I don't know if this is, like I said, if this is like way up in the Caucasus or this is Africa. I'm not sure. We'll have to look in when it. Never heard of Ebla before. Never heard of this channel before, but hey, we struck gold. Glad you're here. I'm Shields. This is what we do. We react to history content and we learn. Let's jump in.
In the early Bronze Age, over 4,000 years ago,
Oh, we're going backwards.
a city in an ecologically marginal area in Syria expanded
Okay, so we're in Syria. Oh, is that the Mediterranean then?
from being a small city to what at least one modern scholar has termed the first recorded world power. But is that a fair characterization? And if so, how did they rise to such heights of power so quickly? Let's dig in.
Let's dig in. I love it.
Ebla was known from Mesopotamian sources before the actual site was ever discovered. It was known from, among other things, Sargonic inscriptions, where Ebla was a noted campaign conquest. Conquering it was a feat worth mentioning. But it was not until 1968, during excavations at Tel Mardik in modern Syria,
Tel Mardik. Okay.
that a fragment of a basalt statue was found that had a cuneiform inscription on it. And the inscription was deciphered and read as Ibit-Lim, son of Igrish-Khep, king of Ebla.
So the Ebelites. So that means a people. So the Ebelites are a people. Okay.
The Mystery Kingdom had at long last been identified. While finding the center of a lost kingdom is certainly important, it was the recovery of thousands of cuneiform texts found in what is now designated Palace G on the Acropolis of the nearly 60-hectare site that dwarfed even the finding of a lost ancient power. The overwhelming majority of the texts were found in one room in the palace, and archaeologists were even able to tell that the texts were stored and grouped according to subject matter.
Okay, so they had good documentation. That's really cool. So is this just like a subset of Mesopotamia at this point? Cuneiform, Sumeria created cuneiform, and then so forth. Is this just like a subset of that?
Most of the texts are administrative or economic, though I repeat myself. There are a handful of ritual texts, some hymns, some incantations, as well as a few diplomatic messages. And the texts also date to a surprisingly short time span, about 40 years, give or take a decade or two longer. And they all date to the reigns of the final three kings of the first Eblaite kingdom. These tablets are incredibly important for understanding the history and organization of Syria in the early Bronze Age. And while they don't...
And by the way, I know we're already like 2 minutes in. I wanted to say, as my novice historian title suggests, there's a lot of blind spots. I'm not no 70-year-old seasoned vet of history. This is so new to me, specifically the Bronze Age. Don't really talk about it much. Don't even react to a lot of videos in the Bronze Age, so this is a good start. So excuse my ignorance on a lot of this.
don't record itineraries of campaigns or propagandistic boasts that we find in contemporary sites in southern Mesopotamia, the texts are still important for the reconstruction of the history of this period. And there's definitely some truth to the saying an empire runs on paper. One notable aspect of the text is that they are in a Semitic language.
Okay, so it's like a family tree of languages. Okay, so you got the same thing as the Akkadian, the Babylonian, Syrian. Okay, and then, oh, you even got, like, on the left-hand side, you go all the way Ethiopian. So, like, okay. Interesting stuff. Aramaics in this, Hebrews in this, Phoenician. Wow.
The language has been, somewhat unsurprisingly, named Eblaite. It's not clear if this was the common language of Ebla and the Eblaites, or if it was the lingua franca of early Bronze Age Syria used in diplomatic communication, or if it was some kind of a mixture of the two, maybe the dominant dialect of a shared linguistic tradition shared throughout Syria. And there's some disagreement about how to classify the language, with some early linguists suggesting it's just Akkadian with West Semiticisms mixed in, sort of like Spanglish but with Akkadian and West Semitic. Nowadays, most scholars recognize it as a distinct Semitic language, so there are debates whether it is East Semitic or West Semitic. And complicating things is that it borrows Sumerian logograms and certain words and phrases that appear only in Sumerian, and it borrows the cuneiform writing system of Mesopotamia while maintaining West Semitic elements. So it resists an easy classification because Eblite grammar has much in common with Akkadian and East Semitic languages, but the vocabulary has much more in common with West Semitic languages. Though notably, almost all of the Eblite names are West Semitic, which has significance as scholars try to understand people groups and who shaped the history of early Bronze Age Syria, particularly the second urban revolution we see following the end of the Uruk period in the late 4th millennium. Excavations at Tel Mardik have revealed several strata, and we will focus on those pertaining to the early and middle Bronze Ages. Strata termed Tel Mardik 1, 2A, 2B1, 2B2, 3A, and 3B.
All right.
Stratum 1 is not well known archaeologically, and it has produced no records of its own.
So these are epochs, right? That we're looking at, basically. We're looking at eras.
But it represents the foundation of the city and its earliest history, which is, again, generally not known to us.
So like 500 years is this like legendary time? Okay.
However, the Stratum 2A city is when Ebla begins to become a major center. This city is generally regarded as part of the wider phenomenon of the Second Urban Revolution, wherein Syria and southern Anatolia saw the widespread adoption of urban institutions and the formation of regional states. The 2A city spans from roughly 3000 or 2900 to about 2400 BC. Again, this is the first era of urban expansion at the city, contemporary with the early dynastic 1 through 3 period in Mesopotamia and the archaic early Syrian period at other sites in Syria. But excavators still describe it as, quote, obscure. We have very little we can know for sure about this period, in part because the city reached its zenith in the subsequent 2B1 city, which obscures some of the
So it's only like 100 years is their golden age?
foundation horizons of possible 2A structures. We know the names of kings who ostensibly ruled during this period, but we know nothing about their reigns, how long they ruled, or what they accomplished.
We just know like a linear like line of kings. Okay.
But if we use the average length of reigns from other Near Eastern kingdoms, most scholars project the first king of Ebla ruled as late as the early 27th century. While we don't know for sure if this is one dynasty, the deceased kings were routinely offered food and clothes, which elsewhere in the Near East is exclusively offered in ancestor cults, suggesting Ebla had perhaps a 400-year-long dynasty of kings.
And of course that's all assumption, given that, any type of rulers could be deposed, could die, quickly, could be, child rulers that are actually ruled by regents. These could be, you could have intermediate periods without rulers. So there's so many variables here, but these are like the de facto rulers of said region, area, kingdom.
It is this line of kings which ruled in the 2B1 city and quite dramatically increased the city's footprint, both in terms of monumental and religious architecture in the city, as well as its territorial control in the region. Some important elements of the city include, of course, the palace on the Acropolis, Palace G. This was the administrative core of the city. Inscriptions from the palace refer to Ebla and the Saza, with the Saza being the primary administrative district in the city, what many archaeologists take to reflect Sumerian influence on the city's organization. And the palace was not the only important part of the city, though. There were several temples as well, particularly the Temple of the Rock and the Red Temple. Excavators believe both of these temples were involved with the worship of the god Kura, though this is not certain. Certain texts seem to indicate...
Is Kura like is that like a regional god, or is that like an Ebelite only god?
Two temples were devoted to Kura, but again, that's not certain either. The most certain understanding is that the Temple of the Rock was almost for sure devoted to Kura, but we are less clear about the dedication of the Red Temple. And Kura is interesting, as he was the patron deity of the city of Ebla, and probably more specifically the deity of the royal line of kings, as we see rituals where he and his consort Barama were closely linked with the king and queen of Ebla. And while many other gods were worshipped at Ebla, who continued to be revered in Syria and northern Mesopotamia in the centuries that followed,
Okay.
Kura
So like more regional.
had no lasting impact on the religious landscape of Syria after the fall of Ebla.
Oh, never mind.
In fact, we aren't even sure Kura is the right name, as we only have the Eblite sources, which are primarily administrative and not ritual or cultic. And because of the signs used, we can't be certain of how the deity's name was even vocalized.
So we don't really have the phonics of it. So what do we have?
Because of the limits with the sources, we aren't even certain what the god's character was understood to be like. He was associated with oaths, but usually only within Ebla. He was not a guarantor on a treaty with Abarsal, for example, suggesting he was not recognized there. Some of the excavators at Ebla think Kura was an archaic form of the later Ugaritic god El. El was often depicted as living at the source of the waters, and really more of a chthonic than a celestial deity. If this is the case, we may see this at the Temple of the Rock, where the undulating
That's really cool.
bedrock was left unaltered in the temple cella, and wells cut into the local aquifer were dug within the temple.
So it could have been maybe something, especially since they're like in the desert region of the world, Syria, unless there's like oasis given the time period that this is that they lived in. Of course, you obviously you can just attest that by early Egyptian places where they reigned, lived, etc. But adjacent to this, of course, you have Syria. You could have this more be in an oasis area, but if not, you would also even have a contrast to where this would make more sense towards like the aquifers and the water in that canonical like expression to the future Ugaritic, that's how you say it, Ugaric god that was more around water. So therefore, what I'm trying to piece together here is this god could be connected to water.
And scholars have posited may be connecting the temple with the deep mythic waters below the foundation of the earth.
Maybe.
However, other scholars link Kura not with an old primeval chthonic god, but with a young warrior god. This, it is argued, would be more fitting given his association with the institution of kingship at Ebla and the expansionistic impulse we see in Eblite kings. Whatever the case, the textual evidence points to Kura being the primary deity of the city, and his worship linked with the king and the administrative center of the city. It is from this administrative center that we find the Eblite text with which we can examine the history of the final kings of the first Eblite kingdom. To the best of our knowledge, the 2B1 city represents the height of Ebla's power in terms of economic influence, territorial expansion, and
And how do we know, like, are we just utilizing cultural layers here in terms of like the archaeology? Is that how we're dividing these times? It's got to be, right?
diplomatic reach. Before we dive into the history of Ebla, I want to give two caveats. First, I want to note that how we depict Ebla's various rises and falls won't be entirely accurate. Not that we knowingly or intentionally are including errors, only that the nature of Ebla's territoriality is such that it was prone to rapid fluctuations. Ebla relied on client states and what we may call vassal agreements with polities that Ebla believed furthered their interests, particularly economic interests. This means friendly or subordinate entities.
Okay, let me read some of this. With client states comprised, I'm just going to read the whole thing. It is impossible to draw a solid line on a map that demonstrates Ebla's boundaries with any certainty, especially along the highly contested Euphrates, the Euphrates River. Its client states comprise a patchwork of localities, sometimes cut off from direct access to the political core into each other. It is perhaps more helpful to view the Eblaite state as a network of city-states, interesting, or small polities dominated by a central authority, and to de-emphasize the need for geographical contiguity in such an arrangement. Adopting a network approach to understanding the mechanics by which the Eblaite state operated minimizes the complications that arise from trying to envision a fragmented state as a homogeneous territory. Okay. So they're leaning towards a network. Territorial control cannot be completely divorced from geography. However, And so it is necessary to embrace a more nuanced consideration of how hegemony might have spread across a diverse landscape made up of polities of varying degrees of autonomy. So, governances with a central polity being the place that we're just looking at.
These were not always linked up. It really was a network of connected nodes, even if sometimes those nodes were not always linked geographically. Sometimes client states were like islands within territory directly subordinate to Ebla, and other times there were hostile polities between Ebla and their clients. One contiguous territorial state doesn't seem to be the primary ambition of Ebla's foreign policy. Expansion certainly was, but having one contiguous territory fully dominated by Ebla wasn't the only form of expansion Ebla was interested in. So while we will try to be as clear and honest to the sources we have, it won't be perfect.
Okay.
Secondly, there are dozens of place names in both the Eblaite record as well as from other polities like Mari. But many of these named places are not positively identified by archaeologists yet, as in we may know where these places are relative to one another, but we do not know which modern ruin is to be associated with the ancient place names. So again, some of what you see is at times a bit interpretive. And what you see is the product of consultation with several different sources and our best attempt to harmonize what are, at times, mutually exclusive interpretations of the historical geography.
There's so many places like this though in Syria and the Middle East. It's only a matter of time before we can really map everything together, and we'll be able to like deconstruct these caveats at face value.
What we have produced, again, is not perfect, but it's our best effort at being faithful to the sources and the most up-to-date research on the site identifications.
Okay.
With that said, we can trace a number of significant historical episodes in the nearly half-century covered in the Eblaite archives. First, we surmise Ebla was in frequent competition with Mari. In fact, it seems the competition was near constant and often broke out into full-scale war between the first Eblaite kingdom and the second Mariote kingdom. These wars were concluded with treaties, diplomatic marriages, and the exchanging of gifts, that is, tribute, and the political landscape was seemingly ever shifting. Ebla seems to have pursued a policy of allying people far away, at least on the other side of their most immediate enemy. So to oppose Mari, we see Ebla engaged in diplomatic missions to major polities like Kish, Nagar.
I'm guessing you're going to use the Tigris, not the Tigris, that's on the other side, the Euphrates to conduct said missions, right? And maybe the Mari weren't always hostile, because how would you be able to conversate with Kiss without going through Mari? Does that make sense?
Modern Tel Brak in the Khabur Basin, and even as far away as Hamazi.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't always river communication, but it seems like that would be the most pragmatic solution to doing diplomatic conversations with these places.
Several smaller polities were subservient to Ebla, and others sometimes bounced back and forth between allegiance to Ebla and some other kingdom. In what is one of the most historically consequential documents in the Eblaite archive, we can trace several years of conflict between Mari and Ebla. The letter is from the Mariote king Enna Dagan, a king who ruled entirely during the reign of the Eblaite king Irkab Damu. In the letter, Enna Dagan recounts the history of conflict between the two polities in the years leading up to his reign, going back to the reign of the Eblaite king Igrish Halam. As a note, the Eblaite kings were referred to using the Sumerian logogram of En, meaning lord, and these lords had a council of elders, most likely the heads of influential families in Eblaite society, who stayed at least partially at the palace and received allotments of provisions from the palace. But the second most important figure in the kingdom was that of the vizier, referred to with the title Lugos Saza, the head of the administration.
So these people were the record keepers.
These figures were once thought by scholars to be kings, but are now understood to be a kind of prime minister or high-ranking administrator who often had not only civic duties, but also military duties. And we'll see they feature significantly in Ebla's history.
Never mind.
Using Enna Dagan's letter, we can begin to trace the historical circumstances of Ebla and Mari's war. Based on records at Mari, we know Ebla defeated Mari sometime during the reign of Sa'umu. Using the reckoning system noted earlier, scholars posit this Mariote defeat would be at the hands of the Eblaite king Kundamu. However, Enneadegon's letter suggests Saumu was able to claim several victories, with subsequent kings campaigning all the way up to the Eblite vassal state of Ra'ak and Imar.
Wow. So this is just a cat and mouse game of the Euphrates at this point.
The Mariot king Iblu-il, a contemporary of the Eblite king Igrish-Halam, campaigned against Abarsal and into Burman. Ebla was even forced to provide
Dang, so they have like the whole river to themselves.
Mari with what is euphemistically called a gift, but in reality was a quite substantial annual tribute. Scholars posit the reason for these conflicts was primarily vying for control over trade routes through Mesopotamia and Syria, with interest in controlling access to commercial destinations beyond Syria. For example, the Eblite palace seemed to maintain a monopoly on the trade of lapis lazuli. This blue stone was mined as far away as modern Iran and Afghanistan and was especially prized in Mesopotamia. When Palace G was excavated, it had close to 40 kilograms of raw lapis in the palace.
Yeah, lapis lazuli is beautiful.
Likely meant to be either processed into luxury goods or traded onto Egypt via Byblos to go to the Old Kingdom pharaohs. Controlling the trade routes through the Middle Euphrates then was especially lucrative, and Mari sought to cut Ebla off from the Sumerian markets of southern Mesopotamia, where Ebla could not only procure luxury goods, but sell the wool and fabric processed from the palace's large herds. This obviously was not acceptable to Ebla. So while Igrish-Halam paid a heavy tribute, the subsequent king sought to reverse this. Irkab-Damu and his capable vizier Aralum or Arakum, and that vizier's son and future vizier Ibrium were able to turn the tides. First, they waged a war against the kingdom of Abarsil, a kingdom which is known to be on the Euphrates and to have had a port on the river, but where exactly it is debated.
Probably nearby, since they come into contact with them, so I like that idea right across, closest to the river.
In one of the first known treaties ever recorded, Ebla forced Abarsil into accepting conditions disproportionately favorable to Ebla. And while Abarsil was now subordinate to Ebla, it did not remain a loyal vassal, and was ultimately destroyed a few years later.
Did Ebla... They're landlocked in the case of... I guess unless you count that river. I don't know what that river's called on the left-hand side. But did they not have coastal trade, or did they have to rely on other regions to carry out that?
In subsequent years, Haran became the dominant Eblite vassal in the region, a position secured with the royal marriage between Princess Zugalum of Ebla, who became the queen of Haran. And these kinds of diplomatic marriages were also secured with Imar, Dulu, Kish, and Nagar. During the reign of Irkab-Damu, Ebla was the dominant force over cities like Carchemish, Imar, through the Balik River region to Tatul and down to Hamat, though Ebla it seems never maintained any control over the coast, instead having economic contact with...
So that just said that. So they did not have control over the coast. So they basically got the inner region. Okay.
The south and the west, mediated largely through Byblos. At least I should say the current evidence does not indicate strong influence over regions to the west. This may be because Ebla was blocked from the coast by another polity which dominated the Syrian coast,
Probably.
or Ebla did interact with the coast, and the tablets recording interactions to the west were stored in a separate storeroom.
You definitely want to have, unless there's like flood probability, you really want to be on the coast, because that's going to be, you're going to have open trade to places like Cyprus, Minoans, and Egypt, and so forth.
Some scholars suggest that, for whatever reason, records of interactions to the west may have been categorized differently and stored elsewhere in the palace in a room which is either undiscovered or was not preserved, though this is purely speculative.
Yeah.
With Ebla increasing its influence to places like Hadu and especially Arma, Ebla was able to halt the tribute with Mari but could not yet push on Mari directly. Instead, it used diplomacy to box Mari in. And Ebla's diplomatic relations reached far. As they were interested in opening up commercial contacts with regions beyond Mari, they sent delegations to Hamazi and especially to Kish, a city which dominated the Euphrates region south of Mari. Diplomatic correspondence indicates visits between the royalty of both cities. And one document even notes a mathematician from Kish was present in Ebla, something that's been likened to a visiting professorship as part of the cultural exchange between Ebla and Kish.
That's cool. So you have intellectual conversation, not conversation, but collaboration.
Irkab-Damu reigned for less than a decade, and the vizier who succeeded Ar-Alum, Ibrium, would be one of the most successful Eblaite leaders we know of. Ibrium served both Irkab-Damu for a couple years and then served Ishar-Damu for about 18 years. Ishar-Damu was young when he assumed the throne, and so the queen mother and the vizier essentially ran the state.
So we do know about regents. That was a question I had at the beginning. So we do know that there were regents.
Ibrium campaigned against Arma, though never subjugated it. One of the pertinent text notes Ibrium fought alongside his son, Begama, who disappears from the sources after this. We can only speculate as to why this is, but one suggestion is he was killed in one of the wars of expansion Ibrium led, perhaps to the north against either Arma or Khostum, which did capitulate to Ebla. Ibrium waged several wars, and the list of those who fought alongside and those who fought against often have significant overlap, again suggesting the diplomatic landscape shifted constantly, as states would assist Ebla in some wars and fight against them in others. Ibrium died about halfway through Ishar-Damu's reign, and Ibrium's son Ibizikir took over as vizier. Almost every year of Ibizikir's service was on campaign, only occasionally being replaced by Ishar-Damu. The first 6 years were primarily focused on the north, Arma and its satellite states. He also subjugated a tribal confederacy called Ebal, likely located in the Orontes Valley, and the final 6 years were focused on Mari. This was done in a number of ways. As mentioned earlier, political alliances were made by marrying an Eblaite princess, Tigrish Damu, to the
So they're very. This is interesting that the diplomatic process of marriage goes back this far. So they're basically doing the Habsburg playbook this far. Well, Habsburg playbook are doing their playbook. Sorry, the Habsburgs are doing the Ebla playbook.
king of Nagar, the polity north of Mari, and then marrying an Eblaite princess to the king of Kish, further boxing Mari in and cementing relations with Ebla.
That's crazy.
The source material indicates a large coalition supported Ebla as it turned to face Mari directly. In a large battle near Turka, Mari was decisively defeated. However, Ebla did not push their victory and besiege Mari directly. Because our sources are primarily administrative and economic, we don't get a rationale for why this is the case. Instead, an alliance was made, again through marriage, with the king of Mari and again with the king of Kish.
Dang. So they are literally, like I said before, they are doing a Habsburg policy of marriage or strength through marriage, not strength through conquest.
Some scholars suggest Ishar-Damu and Ibizikir made a tactical mistake by not pursuing Mari. Others suggest they were wise to keep a buffer state between themselves and Kish. And whether the decision not to pursue Mari was wise or not depends on how you reconstruct the following historical events. The historical facts are that 3 years after the battle at Turka, the city of Ebla, its temples and palace, were destroyed.
Who?
There is disagreement about who was responsible. One option is that Mari rebounded quickly and was able to not only attack Ebla, but sack the city and completely end its line of kings, with Ishar-Damu or possibly his son Irak-Damu being the final king of the first Eblaite kingdom. If it was not Mari, it was the king of Kish, a man who would become known to history as Sargon the Great. A less widely accepted model is that of natural disaster, citing the lack of looting we see in the destruction of Palestine. However, a natural disaster does not fully explain all of the archaeological evidence nor the textual evidence, as both Sargon and Naram-Sin claim to have conquered Ebla. There are issues with seeing either Sargon or Naram-Sin as sacking Ebla, including issues getting into Mesopotamian chronology, which I will admit makes my brain hurt when I try to work through all the various chronological options. But
Yeah, look, for someone that's way on the outside of this, who is stepping so slowly, so slightly into Mesopotamian history, this is way over my head. And, there's probably so many chronological possibilities here of, not chronological possibilities, but like political possibilities of who could be allianced with who and how things could go down, whether it be politically or militarily, and whether there's like a usurper or whether there's like a coup d'etat of some sort, whether there's like I said, an internal strife, act of God, or an overall campaign that allows for something like this to fall. But TLDR, this is crazy how how interesting I am seeing this. This is so interesting. So interesting.
It's also the fact that Sargon's claim is stated so plainly, and we suspect taking Ebla would have been a major achievement, something worth boasting about. Even
Well, if it's also in the same line of administrative like context, then I would say like the direct notation of it being like a footnote would be all that we would get versus like a chronicle.
more than what we see him do. But it is possible that the claim by Sargon and Naram Sin is about taking the territory of Ebla, even if the city itself was largely still in ruins. It's a difficult issue to disentangle, but seeing Sargon as the culprit for ending the first Eblite kingdom is still one of several, but yet a widely held view. Ebla was down but not out, though it never achieved the same level of power or influence again. The second Eblite kingdom resumed on the site shortly after the fall of the first kingdom. The palace on the Acropolis was abandoned, and a retaining wall was built to keep it from collapsing further, and a new palace was built in the lower city. No inscriptions have been found in this second palace, the so-called Archaic Palace, so we lack a detailed history of the second Eblite kingdom. However, there are a number of conclusions we can draw from the archaeology of the site. For example, the temple sites remained in use even if the temples themselves were refurbished, suggesting a continued reverence for the Eblite gods. This further suggests the dynasty of kings ruling the second Eblite kingdom were local, that is to say, they were not Akkadian governors placed in charge of the city. As the Akkadian Empire weakened, Ebla was able to again exert control over Syria between the Lebanon Mountains and the Great Bend in the Euphrates. From inscriptions and references we get from contemporary polities, like what is known to us as the Third Dynasty of Ur, we can roughly sketch out the territorial extent of Ebla at this time, though it's impossible to know how this may have ebbed and flowed over the years. But by tracking the appearance of polities around Ebla, and when they are known to be either independent or in submission to a non-Eblaite state, it's possible to trace the dissolution of the kingdom of Ebla with the loss of regions like Urshu, Mukish, the land where the cedars are cut, Mana, and others. It is apparent Ebla was less expansionistic.
So that's the Orontes River. Okay, so we learned another thing.
In this phase of its existence than it was in the First Kingdom. The Très Long Mur, or the Very Long Wall, may date to this period.
So there's a wall right here? Like a man-made wall?
This wall encompasses both the arable and prime grazing lands from the south of the Machka region to the Orontes River Valley near the Anti-Lebanon Mountains, and includes within it large quantities of both late Roman and early Bronze IV sites.
That's interesting.
Suggesting it was built in the early Bronze IV, as it is unlikely a structure like this would be necessary in the late Roman period. It is not a defensive structure, but likely a territorial marker.
It's like a border, literally a border,
delineating the territory controlled by either Hama or more likely Ebla in the final centuries of the third millennium. This may have been needed as climate patterns shifted to be more arid, and as nomadic groups, namely the Amorites and Hurrians, spread out from the Syrian steppe and Zagros mountains into the more densely populated and ecologically valuable land. The second Eblite kingdom was also destroyed in fire sometime in or around 2000 BC. A Hurrian poem, found in Hittite translation, records the destruction of Ebla and says it was divine vengeance by the Hurrian storm god Teshub,
So they're saying it's natural.
Had demanded Ebla release captives, but Ebla refused, thus invoking divine wrath. How this mythic telling relates to the history of this time is not entirely clear. Ebla's end was not the only disaster to befall the Near East at this time. Several other polities, like the Third Dynasty of Ur, also collapsed, and in the subsequent Middle Bronze Age, Amorite dynasties arose all over Mesopotamia and Syria. Ebla had a new dynasty of kings which took over in Stratum III, some of the names of which may be Amorite. The basalt statue mentioned earlier of Ibit-Lim is one such king, and this represents a clear shift at the site. The archaic palace continued in use, but the temples shifted away from honoring their traditional deities to honoring new ones, notably Ishtar. The temples to the older Eblite gods, the ones honoring the patron god of the city and the role of kingship in Ebla, are altered, and new deities are honored, suggesting a deep...
And we see that throughout history, like whether it be like a whole new religion coming through or like, all right, we have a better god to worship. Things are reused and repurposed.
Symbolic shift occurred in the Middle Bronze Age, and there's a substantial break with the early Bronze Age kingdoms. Ebla continued to exist during the Middle Bronze Age, but it was a city on the decline, a city resting on its laurels. It had huge symbolic significance for the rising Amorite dynasties, especially for the Amorite Yamhad dynasty in Halab, which vassalized Ebla over the course of the Middle Bronze Age. Ebla ultimately came to the same fate as Halab, destruction by the old Hittite king Mershili I. And while Ebla had sporadic occupation on the site for millennia, it never rose to anywhere near the same level of power and prestige as the first Eblite kingdom in the early Bronze Age. So, was Ebla the first world power? Maybe, but maybe not. Ebla was certainly not a globe-spanning empire, and its power never reached around the world economically, diplomatically, or otherwise. However, Ebla was the first to dominate what we may call an international system, and they did it several years before Sargon formed his Akkadian Empire. It had economic ties from Egypt to Afghanistan. It had direct diplomatic control over dozens of neighboring kingdoms and strong diplomatic influence over several others. Its records show a sophisticated knowledge of business and economics as it spread its mercantile interests throughout the ancient Near East, sometimes by force. And while Mari had success against Ebla for a time, Ebla was able to assert its influence over Mari both on the battlefield and in the field of economics and diplomacy. So a regional hegemon to be sure, but I guess world power status may be in the eye of the beholder.
That's interesting. First off, amazing video. We love new stuff like this. I'm so much more interested now in ancient Mesopotamia than I've ever been, just because I had no idea the dynamics of such. And of course, I understand there's a vast time scale of in the BC time where you have, you know, these pre-Bronze Age kingdoms, post-Bronze Age kingdoms. And the question of, like, was Ebla the first world power? Probably, like, as a choice. Like, there's a, you know, you could throw the ring and throw its crown in the ring, or whatever the metaphor is. You could throw that in there just because it's an option, just given like the diplomatic interest of the intermarrying of other polities that were in the region. That's a very interesting like dynamic of power. There's a lot of other things we don't know. And when we say world power, we have to think of it in like a centralized form, because people have to be subservient for something to be even power. So questions that don't yet have answers might be the real answer. This was awesome, guys. Please give me some more options just like this, whether it be through this channel or through other channels. We really do love new stuff like this. Appreciate you as always. Peace out and bye-bye.